What if a promise could outlive the person who made it? What if it was carried forward, day after day, by a faithful friend waiting on a lonely railroad track for a love that would never return? This is a story about a promise that powerful, and about the weary train engineer who stumbled upon its heartbreaking vigil. It's a story we knew we had to share, and if it touches your heart, please help it travel further by liking this video and subscribing for more tales of unbreakable bonds. The relentless rhythm of the wheels was a language Arthur Jensen had understood for 40 years. Click, clack, click, clack, a steady iron heartbeat carrying him through the final months before retirement. Outside the windows of his locomotive, the world was a ghost. The Cascade Mountains of Washington were lost in a dense, late-autumn fog that swallowed the colossal fir trees and clung to the steel tracks like a shroud. It was a morning to be cautious, a morning that blurred the line between the waking world and a dream. For Arthur, a widower whose own world had felt shrouded for the past 3 years, the fog was just an outward expression of an inner landscape. He was a man of 60, with a full head of graying hair and a face mapped with the fine lines of a life spent squinting into the distance, searching for signals, for changes, for the first sign of trouble. His hands, resting lightly on the controls, were steady and sure, but his eyes held a permanent weariness that had little to do with his job. He thought of Martha, as he often did on these quiet, solitary runs. He imagined her sitting in the jump seat, a thermos of coffee between them, her laughter a warm presence against the cold glass. But the seat was empty, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine and the squeal of the wheels on a tight curve. He was just guiding this 2,000-ton serpent of steel through the woods, a task that felt more like a memory than a living profession now. Just a few more months, he told himself, and this rhythm would finally fall silent. Then he saw it. Not a flicker of movement, but the opposite. A solid, unmoving shape in the heart of the swirling gray, right between the rails. It was too small for a fallen tree, too defined for a rock. His breath caught in his throat. 40 years of instinct screamed in his mind, and his hand slammed down on the emergency brake lever. The train protested with a deafening metallic shriek that tore through the peaceful fog. The cars shuddered violently behind him, their immense weight fighting the sudden command to stop. Arthur held his ground, his knuckles white on the lever, his gaze locked on the shape as it grew slowly larger, clearer. A dog. It was a dog. The hiss of the air brakes finally faded into an unnerving silence, a quiet so profound it felt louder than the preceding chaos. The train had stopped just 50 feet from the animal. Arthur took a deep, shaky breath, his own heart now hammering against his ribs. He grabbed a heavy flashlight, though the morning was dawning, and climbed down the cold steel steps of the locomotive. The damp air bit at his cheeks, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. There it sat, a magnificent German shepherd, its classic black and tan coat made muted and soft by the mist. The dog was a male, fully grown and in his prime, yet he sat with the stillness of a stone statue. He was not panicked by the monstrous machine that had screamed to a halt before him. He was not cowering or barking. He didn't even seem to notice Arthur's approach. Instead, his noble head was turned away, his intelligent amber eyes fixed on the vanishing point of the tracks behind him, into the fog, as if waiting for something to arrive from the life he had left behind. It was the most heartbreakingly patient posture Arthur had ever seen. "Hey there, fella," Arthur said, his voice softer than he intended, barely a whisper in the vast quiet. "You're a long way from anywhere. What are you doing out here?" The dog's ear twitched, but he didn't turn. Arthur took another slow step, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He wasn't a dog person, not since Martha had passed, but something about this creature's profound sorrow resonated deep within his own. "Come on, boy. This is no place to sit and wait." Finally, the shepherd turned his head. His eyes met Arthur's, and there was no fear in them, only a deep, soulful weariness that felt achingly familiar. He looked at Arthur, then back down the empty track, as if torn between a new presence and an old duty. After a long moment, With a quiet sigh that ruffled the fur on his chest, the dog rose slowly to his feet. He didn't bound away. He simply waited, accepting. With a gentle word of encouragement, Arthur coaxed him toward the locomotive, and the dog followed, climbing the steel steps with a slow, deliberate gait. Inside the warm, humming cabin, the dog shook the dampness from his coat and then settled onto the floor with the same quiet dignity. Arthur knelt beside him, running a gentle hand over his neck. He felt a worn leather collar beneath the thick fur. His fingers found a small, cool metal tag. He angled it toward the light of the control panel, his aging eyes struggling to make out the engraving. It wasn't a name or a phone number. It was just a single, elegantly scripted word, a word that felt impossibly heavy in the quiet of the morning. The rest of the run into Cedar Creek was a strange and silent affair. The German shepherd lay on the floor of the cabin, a quiet shadow of sable and tan fur, his amber eyes occasionally lifting to watch Arthur's practiced movements. But mostly, he slept, a deep and exhausted sleep that only comes after a long vigil. For Arthur, the locomotive cabin, his sanctuary of solitude for so many years, felt entirely different. It was no longer empty. The presence of the dog, and the single haunting word engraved on his collar, filled the space with a question that hummed louder than the diesel engine, always. The word echoed in Arthur's mind, a fragment of a promise he didn't understand, but felt the weight of nonetheless. Upon arriving at the rail yard, he made his final checks and radioed in the end of his shift, omitting any mention of his temporary passenger. This felt personal, a mystery that procedure and paperwork couldn't solve. He led the dog to his old pickup truck, and the animal hopped into the passenger seat without hesitation, sitting upright and looking out the window. As they drove the winding road toward the small cabin Arthur had shared with Martha. The house was just as he'd left it, neat, quiet, and profoundly lonely. It was a home scrubbed, clean of personality. Everything in its place, as if holding its breath, waiting for someone who would never return. Dust-free photographs of a smiling, vibrant Martha lined the mantelpiece, her eyes seeming to follow him as he walked in, the silent dog trotting at his heels. His first calls were to the county sheriff and then to animal control. The conversations were brief and predictable. "A German shepherd, you say? Black and tan?" No, reports of a missing dog matching that description, Art." The dispatcher on the other end said, her voice familiar and kind but unhelpful. He left his number, but he knew it was a long shot. This dog hadn't seemed lost. He had seemed purposeful, dedicated to his strange, sad mission on the tracks. As evening fell, a quiet routine began to form. Arthur opened a can of beef stew for himself and set a bowl of water and some leftover pot roast on the floor for the dog. The shepherd ate slowly, without the usual canine enthusiasm, then curled up on the braided rug before the stone hearth where Arthur had built a small fire. The crackle of the flames was the only sound for a long time. The silence in the house was different now. It was no longer an empty, aching void. It was a shared quiet, a companionship of two solitary beings. "I don't know what your story is, fella," Arthur murmured, looking down from his worn armchair. "But you're a loyal one, I'll give you that, waiting out there like that." The dog lifted his head, his soft eyes blinking in the firelight, as if he understood. Later, as the fire burned low, Arthur reached down to gently stroke the dog's thick neck. His fingers traced the worn leather of the collar, feeling its age, its history. He felt the single metal tag again, but then his fingers brushed against something else, something small and hard tucked just behind it, almost hidden in a fold of the leather. Curious, he coaxed the dog to lift his head closer to the warm glow of the floor lamp. He carefully worked the small object free. It was a charm, no bigger than his thumbnail, tarnished with age but intricately made. His breath hitched. It was a perfect, tiny replica of a steam engine's whistle, crafted from silver. Always was a word of love, a promise between people, but a train whistle that was a symbol of his world, of the rails, of a life dedicated to the line. The mystery suddenly shifted, pulling into sharper focus. This wasn't just a lost pet. This dog's story was tied to the railroad as deeply and surely as Arthur's own. And in a small town like Cedar Creek, there was only one place where the stories of the railroad lived and breathed. He looked at the dog, a new resolve hardening in his eyes. "Tomorrow," he said softly, his voice firm with purpose. "Tomorrow we're going to the Whistle Stop Diner. I think old Sam might have some answers for us." The next morning, a fragile sun worked to burn through the last remnants of the fog. Arthur found a new sense of purpose in his movements as he got ready. He filled a bowl with fresh water for the German shepherd, who watched him with a quiet, unwavering gaze. "All right, fella," Arthur said, patting the dog's broad head. "Let's go see an old friend." The Whistle Stop Diner sat on Cedar Creek's main street, a long, low building with a sign shaped like a locomotive. Inside, the air was thick with the comforting smells of frying bacon, strong coffee, and decades of conversations. The walls were a living museum of railroad history, covered in framed photos of old steam engines, faded timetables, and commemorative plates. Behind the counter, wiping it down with a practiced cloth, was Sam. He was a man in his mid-70s, his back a little stooped from a life of hard work, but his blue eyes were as sharp and observant as they were the day he retired as the station master. He was the town's unofficial memory keeper. "Morning, Art? The usual?" Sam asked, his voice a friendly rasp. "Just coffee this morning, Sam." "Thanks," Arthur said, sliding onto a worn vinyl stool at the counter. He took a sip of the hot liquid, letting the familiar bitterness settle him. He glanced out the window at his truck, where the shepherd sat patiently, looking toward the diner door. "Got a new friend, I see," Sam noted, following his gaze. "Something like that," Arthur said slowly. "Found him yesterday, up on the tracks past the old trestle." He described the dog's strange, mournful vigil, the way he sat looking down the line, unafraid and unwilling to move. Sam listened, his expression thoughtful, a look Arthur had seen many times when someone brought him a piece of a puzzle. Then Arthur reached into his pocket and placed the small tarnished silver whistle on the polished countertop. Sam stopped wiping. His gaze fell to the tiny object, and a wave of recognition, swift and sad, washed over his features. The friendly diner owner vanished, replaced by the old station master who remembered everything. He picked up the whistle, his thumb rubbing over it gently, as if handling a fragile memory. "Let's sit down, Art," he said, his voice softer now. He gestured to a booth in the corner. "This story, it deserves a proper telling." Once they were seated, Sam cradled the tiny whistle in his palm. "I haven't seen this in 5 years," he began, his eyes distant. "This belonged to a good kid, David Sterling." He looked at Arthur. "He was an engineer like you, one of the best I ever saw, full of passion for the rails. He was engaged to a young woman, Eleanor Vance. Everyone just called her Ellie." A sad smile touched Sam's lips. Ellie was an artist. She saw beauty in everything, from the rust on an old boxcar to the wildflowers growing by the tracks. She gave this whistle to David as a gift for his first solo run. And the word on his dog's tag, always, that was their word. Their promise to each other. It's what they said instead of goodbye. Arthur felt a knot tighten in his chest. He could picture them, two young people full of life and plans, their world as wide and open as the Washington sky. Sam's expression grew somber. 5 years ago, on a nasty night in October, David was driving a freight train down from the summit. A section of track, weakened by the rains, gave way. The train derailed. He paused, the memory still raw. It happened on their anniversary. He was trying to get home early to celebrate with her. The air in the diner suddenly felt heavy, thick with the weight of the tragedy. Arthur looked out the window at the dog, who was still waiting, a living monument to that terrible night. "It broke her," Sam said, his voice barely a whisper. "Ellie wasn't just a fiancée who lost her love. She was a whole world that lost its son." The railroad that had been the backdrop to their love story became the villain that stole it all away. She was never the same after that. And Max, well, Max was David's dog first. But after the accident, he became Ellie's shadow, her only comfort. Sam looked directly at Arthur, his eyes filled with a deep, shared understanding of loss. Now I guess you know what that dog was waiting for out there on the tracks. Arthur sat frozen in the diner booth, the warmth from his coffee cup long forgotten. He looked past Sam, out the window to where the German shepherd waited in his truck, and the dog's quiet patience suddenly carried an unbearable weight. The story wasn't over. He could see it in the profound sadness of Sam's eyes. The accident was the beginning of the tragedy, not the end. "So what happened to her, Sam?" Arthur asked, his voice low. "What happened to Ellie?" Sam sighed, a long, tired sound that seemed to carry the weight of the whole town's sorrow. "After the accident," he began, "Ellie built a new life, of a sort. But it was a life made of memories. Every single day, Art, at 3:15 in the afternoon, she would leave her little cottage. That was the time David's train was always scheduled to pull into the yard. And she would walk up to that same spot on the tracks, the one just past the trestle, with Max right by her side, and they would just wait." He paused, letting the image settle. It wasn't frantic. It was a ritual, a quiet, solemn thing. She'd stand there, looking down the empty rails as if she could will his train to appear over the horizon. It was her way of keeping him alive, you see, of refusing to let that final day be the end of their story. For her, as long as she was waiting, he was still on his way home. Arthur thought of his own rituals, the way he still set 2 mugs out for coffee some mornings before he remembered. The way he sometimes turned to share a thought with Martha before the silence of the room reminded him she was gone. He understood. "She did that for 4 years, Sam continued, his voice growing softer. "But grief is a sickness, too. It wears you down from the inside. The light that was Ellie just faded. She got sick last year, quietly. Didn't put up much of a fight. She passed away last fall, almost a year ago now." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a devastating finality. Arthur looked at Sam, his heart aching. "And Max?" "That's the part that gets you," Sam said, shaking his head in wonder. "We all figured the dog would stay home, that the ritual would end with her, but he didn't. The day after her funeral, at 3:15, he trotted out of that empty house and walked the path up to the tracks all by himself. And he's done it every single day since. Through the winter snow, the spring rain, the summer heat. He keeps the watch for both of them now." In that moment, Arthur's perception of the world shifted. He replayed the scene from the day before, the massive engine screaming to a halt, the dog sitting calmly in the fog. He hadn't been waiting for Arthur's train. He hadn't been waiting for any train at all. He was waiting for Ellie. He was continuing their shared act of remembrance, a lone soldier standing guard over a love that time could not erase. The depth of that loyalty, that pure, unwavering devotion, struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just a man who had found a stray dog. He had stumbled upon a sacred place, a living, breathing memorial to a love story he never knew. This beautiful, sad creature was the keeper of a promise, the last remaining testament to Ellie and David. And in the dog's profound grief, Arthur saw a reflection of his own. He understood the long, quiet years, the ache of an empty house, the instinct to keep a memory alive against all odds. His heart, so long shuttered and guarded, cracked open with a deep, resonating empathy for the loyal animal waiting in his truck. Arthur left the diner that day with the weight of a life story settled upon his shoulders. The next few days passed in a new, quiet understanding. He and Max coexisted in the small cabin, 2 solitary souls orbiting a shared center of grief. Arthur watched as, each afternoon around 3 o'clock, the dog would grow restless. He would pace to the door, look out toward the woods that led to the tracks, and let out a soft, low whine. It was the sound of a duty he could not forsake. Arthur knew then that he couldn't simply keep the dog contained. A memory so powerful deserved to be honored, and a loyalty so deep deserved to find peace. On the third afternoon, armed with a new resolve and a single white rose he'd bought in town, Sam had told him it was Ellie's favorite. Arthur stood up as Max began his restless pacing. "All right, boy," he said softly. "Let's go. But this time, we go together." They walked the familiar path through the forest, but today felt different. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the autumn sun cast long, golden shadows through the fir trees. It was a day for clarity, for goodbyes. When they reached the clearing, Max moved to his usual spot, but he paused and looked back at Arthur, waiting. For the first time, they were here as companions. Arthur walked to the track where he had first seen Max. With a reverence he didn't know he possessed, he knelt and gently placed the single white rose upon the cold, hard steel. The delicate, perfect petals were a stark contrast to the unforgiving iron, a small beacon of beauty and love in a place of loss. He remained kneeling, turning to face Max, who watched him with those ancient, knowing eyes. "They're at peace now, old friend," Arthur said, his voice thick with an emotion that was as much for Martha as it was for Ellie and David. "She's at peace, and so is he. You've been a good and faithful friend. You kept your promise. But it's over. It's time to come home now, for good." He held his breath, his heart aching. Max looked from Arthur's face to the white rose on the track, and then back to Arthur. He took a slow step forward, lowered his noble head, and for the first time, a slow, warm tongue pressed against the back of Arthur's weathered hand. It wasn't a frantic lick of excitement, but a deliberate, gentle gesture of understanding, of release, of a new trust being forged. A tear Arthur hadn't realized was forming, finally escaped and traced a path through the lines on his cheek. They turned their backs on the tracks and walked away together, leaving the white rose to stand its own vigil. They didn't walk as a rescuer and his charge, but as equals, two souls who had found each other in the wilderness of grief, and were now, finally, heading home. That evening, the fire in the hearth burned with a different kind of warmth. It was not a defense against the cold and lonely quiet, but a celebration of presence. Max lay curled on the rug at Arthur's feet, not with the tense exhaustion of before, but with the deep, peaceful slumber of an animal who knows he is safe, his long duty fulfilled. For the first time in 3 years, the house did not feel empty. The silence was not a void, but a comfortable peace. Arthur looked at the magnificent dog sleeping by his fire and knew his approaching retirement was no longer a vast, empty expanse. It was a future filled with walks through the woods, with the quiet companionship of a loyal friend, with a reason to care deeply once more. He had not just saved a dog, he had been given a gift, a living reminder that even after the deepest loss, love always finds a way to continue. The greatest love stories, it seems, don't always have an ending. They simply change form, carried forward in the heart of a faithful companion, waiting patiently on a lonely track for a kind soul to help them find their way home. We believe every quiet act of loyalty deserves to be told and remembered. If you believe that too, and wish to continue this journey with us, we invite you to join our community so that more stories like this are never forgotten.